It is the year 930, and there is no king in Iceland. This is not a temporary condition. It is not the result of a recent death or a disputed succession or a political crisis waiting to be resolved. There is no king in Iceland because the people who settled Iceland, beginning in 870, came from Norway specifically to escape a king, and they built their new society with the deliberate intention that what they were building would have no king in it. They succeeded, and the institution they built instead is still in operation today. The Althing, the All-Assembly, the General Assembly of the Icelandic Commonwealth, meets for the first time in 930 at a place called Ingvellir. The Assembly Plains, a flat rift valley in the southwest of Iceland where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are slowly pulling apart from each other. The lava field at Ingvellir is 10,000 years old. The democracy that begins meeting on it in 930 is, by the measure of democratic institutions that have operated continuously since their founding, the oldest parliament in the world. The men who gather there are farmers, not nobles in the European sense, not a warrior aristocracy of the kind governing France and England and Germany at exactly this moment, not a priestly hierarchy or a merchant oligarchy. Farmers who own land, who keep livestock, who have families and disputes and opinions, and who have traveled from across Iceland, some of them for 2 weeks on horseback, to participate in the 2 weeks of collective governance that the Althing represents. While they are making this journey, the King of France is ruling by divine right. The King of England is ruling by conquest and inheritance. The Holy Roman Emperor is ruling by a combination of military power and papal endorsement. In every significant political entity in the European world of 930, power flows downward from a single person at the top whose authority is either hereditary or divinely sanctioned or both. And the people being governed have no formal mechanism for participating in the decisions that govern their lives. On the assembly plains of Iceland, power flows upward from the assembled community. This is the distinction that matters, and it is not a small one. To understand why the North produced this, you need to understand where they came from and what they were escaping. Harald Fairhair, the Norwegian king who unified most of Norway under his rule in the late 900s, did so through a combination of military conquest and the systematic subordination of the independent chieftains who had previously governed their own territories. The chieftains who refused subordination had two options: submission or exile. Many of them chose exile, sailing west to the Faroe Islands, to Orkney, to Shetland, and most significantly to Iceland, the large island in the North Atlantic that Irish monks had reached in the 8th century and that Norse settlers began occupying in 870. The men who sailed to Iceland were not fleeing poverty or seeking adventure in the simple sense that the popular image of Viking migration suggests. They were men of status, men who had exercised real local power in Norway, men who understood governance because they had practiced it, and men who had a specific and personal grievance against the centralization of power that Harald Fairhair represented. They brought with them the institution that had governed Norse communities for centuries before Harald's unification: the Thing. The Thing, pronounced with a hard th like the English word, is the oldest word for a democratic assembly in any Germanic language, and its descendants are everywhere in the Germanic world if you know how to look for them. The English Parliament met in a thing before it was called a parliament. The German Bundestag takes its name from the same root. The Icelandic Parliament is still called the Althing today. The word itself is the oldest surviving trace of an institution that predates writing in Northern Europe, that was operating in the forests of Scandinavia and Germany before Rome arrived and continued operating after Rome left. The local thing, the community-level assembly that met every few weeks to settle disputes and make decisions affecting the immediate community, was the basic unit of Norse governance. It was not a democratic institution in the sense that every person in the community had equal standing. Women attended but could not vote. Slaves attended and had no standing at all. Men of higher social status carried more weight in the deliberations than men of lower status. And a powerful chieftain's opinion moved the assembly in ways that an ordinary farmer's opinion did not. But within these limitations, which were the limitations of the society that produced the institution rather than of the institution itself. The thing operated on a principle that was genuinely revolutionary in the context of the early medieval world. Disputes were settled by deliberation among the community rather than by the unilateral decision of a lord. And the law that governed those deliberations was a shared possession of the community rather than an instrument of whoever was powerful enough to enforce their will. The law speaker is the figure who makes the Norse legal tradition most vivid to a modern audience, and he deserves to be understood carefully. In a society without writing, the law cannot be preserved in books. It is preserved in memory, specifically in the memory of the person whose designated role is to hold the law on behalf of the community. The Norse law speaker was elected for a term of 3 years, during which his primary formal obligation was to recite the entire law code of the community from memory, 1/3 per year, standing at the law rock where the assembly gathered, so that every member of the community heard the law spoken aloud, and no one could claim ignorance of it. The cognitive achievement this represents is extraordinary. The law code of the Icelandic Commonwealth, as it was eventually written down in the 13th century in the document called Gragas, the Grey Goose, runs to several hundred pages of dense legal text covering every aspect of community life from inheritance to homicide to the obligations of neighbors to each other. The law speaker who held all of this in his head, who could be asked any legal question and produce the relevant provision, who recited it publicly with sufficient accuracy that the assembled community could correct him if he erred, was not a bureaucrat. He was a living library, and the trust placed in him was the trust that a community places in the institution that makes everything else function. The law speaker was also the closest thing the Icelandic Commonwealth had to a chief executive, and the limitations of that role reveal everything about the system's design philosophy. He could not make law. He could only state it. He could not enforce decisions. He could only declare what the law said about a situation, and the enforcement of that declaration was the collective responsibility of the assembly and the parties involved. His authority was entirely epistemic. He knew the law, and entirely dependent on the community's willingness to treat his knowledge as binding, which it was because the alternative was a legal system that every individual interpreted for themselves, which was not a legal system, but a recipe for the kind of perpetual violence that the thing system was specifically designed to prevent. The violence prevention function of a thing is essential to understanding why it developed and why it worked. Norse society was a society with weapons, with a culture of personal honor that made insults and injuries into occasions for retaliatory violence, and with no police force, no standing army, and no centralized enforcement mechanism. The thing did not eliminate violence. It channeled it. It gave disputes an alternative resolution path that was available before violence became necessary, and that was often, though not always, chosen instead. The mechanism was the blood feud and its legal management. When a man was killed in Norse society, his family had both the right and the obligation to seek compensation or revenge. Compensation was the preferred outcome from the legal system's perspective, because revenge produced counter-revenge, and the escalation could depopulate entire communities. The thing provided the forum in which compensation could be negotiated, the framework of law that specified what compensation was appropriate for which injuries, and the collective authority that could declare an individual outlawed if they refused to accept a settlement that the assembly considered just. Outlawry was the ultimate sanction of the Norse legal system, and it was more severe than it might sound to modern ears. An outlaw was a person outside the law, which meant outside the protection of the law. Anyone could kill an outlaw without legal consequence. An outlaw's property could be seized. He had no legal standing to bring claims or to defend against them. He was, in the most literal sense, available to a society without prisons or execution as routine judicial tools, expelled from the human community and left to survive, or not in a landscape that offered no shelter and no assistance. Full outlawry lasted for life and could be avoided only by leaving Iceland entirely, which many outlaws did, sailing to Norway or to the Norse settlements in the British Isles, or, in some cases, to Greenland. Eric the Red reached in 985 following his own outlawing from Iceland. Partial outlawry, a lesser sentence, lasted 3 years and allowed the outlaw to leave and return. Both forms of the sentence were imposed by the assembly collectively, recorded by the law speaker, and enforced by the community as a whole rather than by any single authority. The system's effectiveness depended on the community's willingness to enforce it, which was not guaranteed and was not uniform. Powerful chieftains could sometimes ignore sentences imposed on their followers or resist sentences imposed on themselves. The Icelandic sagas, the great narrative literature of the Norse world written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, but describing events of the 9th through 11th, are full of cases in which the formal legal machinery of the thing was insufficient to contain the violence of men powerful enough to override it. The sagas are also full of cases in which the thing worked as designed, in which disputes that would otherwise have produced generations of bloodshed were resolved through deliberation and compensation, in which the law was stronger than the individual who broke it. The Althing, the national assembly that the Icelandic settlers established in 930, was the thing system scaled up to the level of an entire country. It met for 2 weeks every summer at Ingvellir. During those 2 weeks, it functioned as the supreme legislative, judicial, and executive authority of the Icelandic Commonwealth. Laws were made at the Althing. Major disputes were adjudicated there. The court system that operated during the rest of the year reported to it. Chieftains from across Iceland attended, along with the freemen who followed them, and the gathering at Ingvellir was simultaneously the highest legal authority in Iceland and the largest social event of the year. A marketplace and a festival and a court and a parliament all occupying the same Rift Valley for 14 days every June. The physical design of Ingvellir reflects the functional requirements of public deliberation in a society without amplification technology. The Law Rock, the Logberg, was positioned at the base of a natural cliff that acted as a resonating surface, projecting the speaker's voice outward over the assembled crowd in the way that a theater's curved walls project sound toward the audience. The choice of this specific location was not accidental. The people who established the Althing in 930 chose a site where a man standing on a rock could be heard by several thousand people gathered on the plain below him, because the institution they were building required that a man standing on a rock be heard by several thousand people, and they chose the rock that made this possible. This is the detail that most directly connects the Norse thing to the modern democratic imagination. The design of the speaking position, the acoustic engineering of a site where every voice could reach every ear, reflects a political philosophy in which the voice of the individual addressing the community is the fundamental unit of political action. The rock is not a throne. It is a podium. The man standing on it has the community's attention for as long as he holds it, and the community's response, the collective noise of approval or disapproval that the Norse sources describe, is the mechanism by which the assembly communicated its judgment in real time. The noise of the assembly was itself a form of voting. The Norse sources describe the community's approval of a legal decision or a proposed course of action through the weapon clashing or the shouting that expressed collective agreement, and a law speaker and the chieftains presiding could gauge the assembly's inclination from the quality and volume of this response. It was not a count ballot. It was not a secret vote. It was the audible expression of community sentiment by several thousand people simultaneously, and it was the mechanism by which the assemblies became legible to the people responsible for acting on it. The thing system did not operate only at the level of the Althing. It operated at every level of Norse community organization, from the local thing that met every few weeks to settle neighborhood disputes, to the regional things that met several times a year to handle matters too large for the local assembly and too small for the national one. This hierarchical structure of assemblies, each with its own jurisdiction and its own law speaker, created a legal system that was simultaneously local in the sense of being administered by people who knew the specific circumstances of the cases before them, and universal in the sense of applying the same body of law across the entire community. The regional things of Norway, from which the Icelandic settlers had come, were called by specific names that survive in the historical record. The Gulating in western Norway, the Frostating in the north, the Eidsivating in the east, the Borgarthing in the south. Each had its own law code, its own law speaker, its own traditions of procedure and precedent. Each was a functioning legislative and judicial assembly that governed the communities within its jurisdiction through deliberation and collective decision-making. And each predated Harold Fairhair's unification by a period long enough that the exact origins of the Thing system are not recoverable from the historical record. The Thing existed before writing. Its origins are in the oral tradition and the unrecorded practice of communities that left no documents. By the time the Norse world begins to produce written records, in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Thing is already old enough that the sagas treat it as a given, as an institution so fundamental to Norse society that its existence requires no explanation. It is simply the way that decisions are made, the way that disputes are resolved, the way that the community understands itself as a community. The contrast with the rest of Europe at this moment requires emphasis, because without the contrast, the significance of what the Norse were doing is difficult to fully grasp. In England in 930, Athelstan is king by inheritance and by the military power that inheritance gives him access to. His decisions are law. His courts administer justice in his name. The people governed by his decisions have no formal mechanism for participating in them, no assembly where their voices count, no law speaker who holds the law as a possession of the community rather than as an instrument of royal will. The Witan, the council of English nobles and churchmen that advised the king, was a consultative body that the king could ignore and frequently did. It was not a parliament in any sense that the Norse Thing would have recognized. In France, the Carolingian successor states are organized on the feudal principle that every person holds their position, their land, and their rights at the pleasure of the person above them in the hierarchy, and every person above them holds their position at the pleasure of the person above them. And at the top of the hierarchy is the king whose authority is sanctioned by God and administered by the church. The peasant farmer of 10th century France has no legal standing to challenge the decisions of his lord, no assembly to bring his grievances to, no community of equals whose collective judgment might override the Lord's unilateral will. He is, in the legal framework of his world, an object of governance rather than a participant in it. The Norse farmer who brought his dispute to the Thing was a participant in governance in a sense that the French peasant of the same century was not, and this difference was not lost on the people living it. The Norse sagas described the Thing as the space where a farmer could stand up to a chieftain and be heard, where the law was the same for the powerful and the ordinary, where the community's collective judgment could override the will of even the most powerful man in the region. This did not always happen in practice. The powerful bent the system in their favor, as the powerful have always bent every system in their favor. But the principle that the law was above the individual, that even a chieftain was subject to the same legal framework as the farmer he dominated, was a structural feature of the Thing that had no equivalent in the feudal monarchies of the same period. The Thing system spread wherever the Norse went, which in the 9th and 10th centuries was nearly everywhere reachable by sea. The Norse settlers who established communities in the British Isles brought the Thing with them. The Isle of Man's Parliament, the Tynwald, is one of the oldest continuously operating legislative assemblies in the world, with roots in the Norse settlement of the island in the 9th century. Its annual outdoor ceremony, in which laws passed during the year are formally promulgated on Tynwald Hill before the assembled community, is a direct survival of the Norse Thing tradition, practiced every July 5th on a hill in the Irish Sea in a ceremony that has been performed, in some form, for over 1,000 years. The Danelaw, the part of England that was under Norse control through much of the 9th and 10th centuries, developed legal traditions influenced by the Thing system, and some historians have traced the origins of certain features of English common law. The jury system, the concept of the community's role in legal proceedings, to the Norse legal tradition that the Danelaw introduced into England. These connections are debated and the lines of influence are not always direct or clear, but the general principle that the Norse legal tradition contributed something to the development of English legal culture in the period of Norse settlement is widely accepted. The Thing's most important and most direct legacy is the Icelandic Althing itself, which has operated, with interruptions and in various forms, from 930 to the present day. It is the oldest parliament in the world, and it is Norse. The Icelandic Commonwealth that the Althing governed lasted until 1262, when the internal conflicts of the chieftains, the blood feud politics that the sagas document with such narrative intensity, produced a level of violence that the Thing system could no longer contain, and Iceland submitted to the Norwegian crown. The Althing continued to function under Norwegian and later Danish sovereignty, reduced from a sovereign legislature to an administrative court, and was eventually reinstituted as a full legislature when Iceland achieved independence in 1944. The continuity is remarkable, and the gap between the institution's founding purpose and its subsequent history is instructive. The Althing was founded by people escaping a king. It ended its first phase of operation by submitting to one. The tension between the democratic impulse and the centralizing tendency of power is not a modern problem. It is the oldest problem of governance, and the Norse Thing system encountered it and was eventually overcome by it, as every democratic institution before the modern period was eventually overcome by the same centralizing force. The Christianity that arrived in Iceland at the Althing of the year 1000 is one of the most dramatically documented moments in the history of religious conversion, and it reveals something essential about the Thing system's relationship to community decision-making. The Althing of 1000 faced a crisis. Half of Iceland had converted to Christianity, half remained committed to the Old Norse religion, and the two communities were on the verge of split that would have ended the Icelandic Commonwealth by dividing its legal framework along religious lines. Two separate law codes, two separate assemblies, two separate communities sharing an island. The political logic was pulling toward dissolution. The assembly turned to the law speaker, a man named Orgerald Svetningagoy, who was himself a practitioner of the old religion. He withdrew under his cloak for a full day and night, which the sources describe as a period of deliberation or of divine consultation, depending on the religious perspective of whoever is describing it. And when he emerged, he declared that Iceland would become Christian, that the old public practices of the Norse religion would be abandoned, and that the law of Iceland would be one law for one people. His declaration was accepted by the assembly. Iceland converted. The Commonwealth survived for another 2.5 centuries. The episode is extraordinary for several reasons. A man of the old religion declared for the new one, prioritizing the unity of the community over his personal beliefs. The assembly accepted a decision made by one person, but that person had been chosen by the community to hold the law, and his authority derived from that selection rather than from any claim of divine right or inherited power. The decision was reached through deliberation rather than force. In a situation where force was the obvious alternative and where the assembled community had the weapons to pursue it. It is one of the cleaner examples available in the historical record of a democratic institution choosing its own survival over the preferences of its constituent factions. The modern world did not learn democracy from the Norse. The founders of the American Republic looked to Athens and Rome for their models. The architects of the French Revolution looked to the Roman Republic and to Enlightenment philosophy. The British parliamentary tradition traces its lineage through Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution rather than through the Danelaw, even though the Danelaw influence is there in the background if you know to look for it. The Norse democratic tradition was largely forgotten by the time modern democracy needed models to follow, partly because Iceland was a peripheral and obscure part of the European world, partly because the tradition had been suppressed by centuries of Norwegian and Danish monarchy, and partly because the great democratic thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries were working in a classical education system that privileged Greek and Latin sources and had little access to Old Norse texts. The recovery of the Norse democratic tradition is a project that began seriously in the 19th century, when Icelandic scholars began editing and publishing the sagas and the legal codes, and when the romantic nationalism of the period made the idea of a specifically Norse democratic heritage politically useful for movements seeking independence from the Danish crown. The Icelandic independence movement in the 19th and 20th centuries drew explicitly on the Althing's history as evidence of Iceland's capacity for self-governance. And the restoration of the Althing as a full legislature in 1944 was both a political achievement and a historical echo of extraordinary depth. The law speaker who stood on the law rock at Ingvellir in 930 and recited the law code of the Icelandic Commonwealth could not have known that what he was doing was historically significant. He was doing his job. He was discharging the obligation that the community had placed on him when they elected him to his position. He was holding the law in his memory so that the community could hold it in common, so that the farmer who needed to know his rights could hear them spoken aloud, so that the chieftain who wished to act outside the law could not claim ignorance of it. That is what democracy looked like in 930. Not a constitution, not a Bill of Rights, not an elected legislature in a building with columns. A man standing on a rock in a rift valley in Iceland, speaking the law from memory to several thousand people who had ridden for 2 weeks to hear it, in a society that had decided 2 generations earlier that they would rather cross the North Atlantic in open boats than live under a king. The decision to cross that ocean is the decision that produced the Althing. The decision to build a society without a king, in a place where no king could easily follow, is the decision that created the space in which the Thing system could develop to its fullest extent, uncontained by the feudal hierarchy that was constraining it everywhere else in the Norse world. The political philosophy that produced Icelandic democracy was not an abstract idea that someone thought of and implemented. It was a practical response to a specific experience of power, the experience of Harald Fairhair's Norway, that produced a specific determination to build something different. The something different they built lasted 332 years as an independent commonwealth, which is longer than the United States has existed. It produced a legal tradition sophisticated enough to be written down in several hundred pages of dense legal text. It produced a literary tradition, the sagas, that is among the greatest bodies of narrative literature in any medieval language. It produced a society that could take the most divisive question available, what God to worship, and resolve it through collective deliberation rather than violence. It was not perfect. It excluded women from full participation. It rested on the labor of slaves who had no legal standing at all. It was dominated by powerful chieftains in ways that its principles did not endorse, but its practice could not prevent. It eventually failed, consumed by the same internal violence that its legal system was designed to contain. But it was the first functioning parliament. The first society in the post-Roman Western world to build governance on the principle that the assembled community, rather than a single person at the top, was the source of legitimate authority. The first to put the law above the individual who held power, and to mean it seriously enough to outlaw chieftains who violated it, and to build an institution specifically designed to make the law a shared possession rather than a private instrument. The grass at Ingvellir grows over lava that is 10,000 years old. The tectonic plates beneath it are still pulling apart, still widening the rift at 2 centimeters per year, still doing what they were doing before human beings arrived, and will continue doing after we are gone. The Law Rock is still there, marked now with a flag, visited by tourists who know and tourists who do not know what happened on it. What happened on it was the first parliament. What happened on it was the first time in the post-Roman world that a community of free people stood on a hillside and decided that the law belonged to all of them and that no one was above it. That idea went on to govern the world. The people who first had it are remembered, if they are remembered at all, for their long ships and their raids. The thing they built that actually mattered has been standing in the same rift valley since 930, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up.